Welcome back to Higher Exchanges. I'm your host, Jesse Redmond, Head of Investor Relations and Business Development at Leaf Brands. I'm once again joined by Morgan Paxia. He's the co-founder of Poseidon. Morgan, what's happening, man?
Hanging in there, doing what we do.
Another day in paradise.
Yeah, I actually just had retweeted a really good or reposted a really good quote that someone had put up there and thought about us and Higher Exchanges, thought about us and Poseidon. Erich, I'm sure you could relate. Is we're all still showing up, and that's the idea.
We are nothing else if not consistent, Morgan. And we're also joined by Erich Mauff. Erich is a partner at FiSai's. Erich, first time on the show. Thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I've listened to the show quite often, and it's always a wonderful forum to talk about the market.
Well, thanks. We appreciate that. And I don't have a huge history with Erich. I think we might have met a couple of years ago, Erich, when Water Tower was thinking about covering Jushi. And I think we had an initial conversation about that. And then we got to know each other a little bit better through some phone calls and through meeting a few times at conferences. And Erich, for me, is definitely one of those guys who has a really sharp mind in the industry. And I love that you have a background in finance. You were an operator at Jushi, and now you're a partner at FiSai's, where you're doing things on the debt side of the cannabis business. But why don't you, for people that don't know you, Erich, why don't you give us a little bit of an overview of your background, how you got started in the business, what drove you over to Jushi, and ultimately how you got to FiSai's?
Yeah, well, thanks. I started my industry on Wall Street, like many of us. Spent just on 20 years at Deutsche Bank in structured finance, ultimately as a vice chairman of the North American business. And then in 2018, with my friend and partner, we co-founded, one of four of us, Jim Cacioppo, started Jushi. At the time, I think the thesis was pretty simple, that this was a interesting business, good growth prospects, and capital structure was going to be what was critical in making it work. The challenges back then, sadly, are very similar to the challenges today. Access to capital was very difficult back then, and it's almost impossible at this stage. Reform. We had Trump had just come in. Sessions was problematic on cannabis, and so we thought it was a good time to build a business. I think we built a good business. We came public. I stepped off Jushi in 2021, and about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, with a few partners, decided to get into the debt side of the business, which is really my background more than an operator's perspective. And we founded FiSai's. It's about a $220 million senior secured debt fund, concentrated positions in a few names. And that's the part of the balance sheet that I think we felt most comfortable at the time. And clearly that is going to be a big part of the potential recovery of the industry over the next few years, because as you're seeing today, the equity markets are broken. The Canadian exchanges never were much of a liquidity source and have proven to be exactly that, not much of a liquidity source. And I'd say 4 years of democratic letdowns have brought us to this point where at this stage regulatory reform is much needed. We were talking about this before the show. 280E was designed to do exactly what it was doing. It was put in place to exercise huge taxes on businesses, illegal businesses, deemed illegal businesses, in order to balloon the tax liability so that the government, through the IRS, could go after the drug dealers. And that is exactly what's playing out, unfortunately, in cannabis today, is if we are subject to 280E, which the IRS says we are, there is only going to be a continued ballooning of those unpaid tax liabilities. Other than one company in the space, no one is able to function paying the full 280E taxation. And I think that's weighing heavily on the market. And then, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about where we stand with rescheduling. and what the new administration's view is on cannabis. They have Morgan. We were talking about it, the proliferation of THC alternatives that are now available, ubiquitously across the United States at convenience stores. So that's problematic. So, yeah, Jesse, you're right. It's we're stepping up every day, but it's a challenging environment, a lot of uncertainty, and markets don't like uncertainty.
And so, Erich, after spending almost 20 years, or maybe more than 20 years at Wall Street, I think you had about 19 years at Deutsche Bank. What led you to say, "Hey, I want to get involved in the cannabis industry," and found Jushi?
It was entrepreneurial, sounded like a great growth space at the time. It needed
Yep.
people that could do capital structure. I'd always wanted to be on the operating side of a business. Absolutely loved building a business from 4 of us to almost 1,900 people when I exited. I'm quite liberal when it comes to your personal freedoms. I think cannabis, having personal experience, which of course is not medically proven, but it is a great alternative to alcohol. It's a much easier to miss a few days or a week of cannabis than it is alcohol. And I think you should, as a 21-year-old individual, should have the right to consume, and a safe, tested, taxed environment appeared to be the most logical path that America, Congress would want to go down. And, I think that's probably all of us made that mistake, thinking that regulation, taxation was a cornerstone of what the market would be. I think the last few years, it's really gotten away. The Farm Bill loophole has been problematic. I think many of the businesses were not well run, with a little bit of exuberance beforehand, and I think we're seeing that correction. As I said to you beforehand, we're kind of in an extinction event. And the real question is, does Tyrannosaurus kovla be the only animal that exists in, a year and a half? And if so, I hope he can eat.
You said a year and a half when we were talking backstage. Can you explain again why you mentioned a year and a half?
Well, I mean, you're seeing at these year-end numbers, and you can just, if you assume that growth is flat, the 280E expansion over this year will be significant. These companies are now large and profitable. Many of them are approaching billion, if not more, a year in sales. And so, 2 more years of 280E are going to create a fairly large unpaid tax liability. The market will focus on that. Correctly or incorrectly, it doesn't really matter. That will be the focus. And then you go into, midterms, and, you could be in stalemate for another couple of years. So it's problematic. I think now's the time to change. I think we've never had more public support behind cannabis. I think the majority of Americans would like common sense reform. The president has talked about common sense reform. I think everyone believes, if THC is available, it should be regulated. And if it's regulated, it's legal. And if it's not regulated, it's illegal. I think we would like to see the $100 billion that's, kind of in the gray market, or the unregulated market that is, maybe a little bit of that is hemp payers, but mostly it's cartels and drug dealers and all the usual channels that have operated for decades distributing drugs in the country. I think that should be removed and put back into American pockets. It should be entering the banking world. It should be, put transparency on it. It's something you hear a lot from this administration, is transparency. I mean, I think the parallel to crypto is exactly the same. I was early in crypto, and, until maybe even 2 years ago, crypto was persona non grata, and it was, some evil thing that had been pushed by the administration to operate in the gray world. And I think the Trump administration came in and said, why would we not just put that in the regulated world, and it will grow or it won't grow, whatever happens, it at least is in a regulated, transparent world. And I think we have to hope that we can get cannabis into that environment. So I think the operators are those that are not good operators or over leveraged. I think they are in a crisis situation. I say this, Jesse, I told you this when we met in Vegas. I don't think we have a debt problem or leverage problem. I think we have a too many company problem. So I think you need to see consolidation. I think you need to see exiting of players. Morgan, it was interesting on the Cresco call, if I'm not incorrect, Charlie was indicating that in, I think, both Illinois and in Pennsylvania, he was short product. So I think, the downside scenario that we're in is you do get some of the less competitive players to exit the market. And so supply starts to go down and the better producers are low. So I think, we need to flush out the system, and it's going to be very painful. It is painful. That's just on the operator's side. And then we clearly need reform. I mean, the industry just cannot maintain itself under these federal regulations. And so I think that is all playing out real time.
And so we talked about this in Vegas too, and I'll ask the same follow-up question that I asked there. Is how do you see consolidation working, Erich? Because you look at what happened with the Cannabis, or at the time Columbia Care and Cresco, and when you put together maps of other companies, it's hard to find ones where you don't have a lot of meaningful overlap. And in some cases, the companies you're trying to combine have maybe a third of their footprint that's just junk or stuff that doesn't make sense anymore. $1 million, $2 million stores. And so when you think about combining, especially some of these tier 2 and 3 assets, even if you blend them with some tier 1 assets, how do you see that big picture working?
I think it's going to be, I think it's relatively simple, Jesse. You either, I think you get rid of the things you don't like. So states where you have duplicative footprints, maybe one cultivation gets gifted back to the owners of it. Maybe stores get closed. I think at these stock prices, when you're not looking to, have a combination, when the initial, Cresco, Columbia Care at the time deal happened, I think you've got a lot more levers to pull when you're in a situation where the combined entity and its kind of survivable footprint is more important than, a CEO and, shareholders maximizing return. I think I think you'll just see two footprints go together. You combine the two, 60% or 65% works. 25% can either be sold or hived off, and the remainder just gets closed, and you exit those markets. So I think you'll see rationalization.
Do you think selling the assets gets to be a challenge? Like, do you think, looking back on Columbia Care and Cresco, it was too hard to sell the assets, or you think it's just a matter of at which price you'd want to sell those assets?
Again, I think that's a great question you could ask. Either of the CEOs, one doesn't exist anymore, but the companies, I'm sure if they could do it again, they would have dropped the prices a lot quicker, and they would have moved at those clearing levels. But they held on. In a down market, Morgan, you've been in the market, Jesse, you've been in the market. A price today that feels like you're giving something away could look like, an absolute steal a few months ago. I mean, no better than MSOS. The day after the election, it dropped significantly. You had a dead cat bounce. You had the opportunity to get out, and it's only been down from there. So I think, price discovery is a strange animal. So I think it's hard to look at those deals in retrospect because it's easy to Monday morning quarterback.
Yep.
But I think in deals going forward, you look at rationalizing the footprint, you get rid of underperforming assets, you make the hard decisions. They're no favorite children that underperform anymore. And so I think you just go through that and you make hard decisions, and you come out the other side with a business that is run correctly for the business, as opposed to satisfying other jurisdictions' desires. CEOs want to get paid. Shareholders want to get paid. You don't want to do the Doge thing. You don't want to fire 65% of the people, which is probably what you should do. So I think when you get into desperate situations, I think you make much more rational decisions. And I think if you see combinations, I think that's how they happen. Maybe things get broken into piecemeal. Things go here and there. I think it's going to be very I think the next year you're going to see some very creative solutions to very difficult problems.
And Erich, you were at Jushi for a good stint there, and you had a period where Jushi was a high growth company, expanding in existing states, moving into new states. Those states were growing. The margins were good. And then over the past couple of years, like many others, they've been waiting for some key states to turn on. Pennsylvania's big, Virginia, and at the same time, like a lot of others, the balance sheet has ballooned a bit in the meantime. The company's found itself in a more difficult situation. Certainly not a dire situation, but certainly not an easy situation right now either. When you look back at the path that Jushi has taken, the opportunities and the challenges, what are your biggest takeaways from that, Erich?
Look, I think when Jim Cacioppo is still the CEO and one of the largest shareholders of the company, I think when he started it, he always had the right thesis. He always said we were a retail first operation. And I think, like everyone, I think we made a few acquisitions at Jushi that was probably in hindsight we shouldn't have had. But I think very much, it's very difficult in 2018, 2019, 2020 to think that Pennsylvania would still be adult use and Ohio would be, PA is medical and we have Ohio that's adult use. It's hard to determine which of these states will flip. I mean, we all made the same mistake. We made a mistake that we thought things would happen quicker than they did. They took longer to happen than we thought. Price compression was always going to be part of the game. That has continued to be so. And these capital structures, it is very difficult in March of 2025 to have believed that the markets would have been closed for this long to almost everyone in the sector, specifically on the equity side. So I think a lot of these assumptions which you make in business, I mean, how many people do you think are littered the streets of crypto today that over the decade plus that crypto has tried to emerge from the ashes have died along the way because it just took so much longer to get a rational administration to say, why would we not embrace the future of digital currencies? Why allow that to grow in the dark embers of China or Taiwan or Japanese Mount Gox exchanges? Why not just bring that into regulated market, allow the smartest, best people in the world to build whatever they build? And why would we not want to bring that onto American shores and own it? I mean, that's just what you do. I mean, it's like the whole Tesla argument is irrespective of what you think of Elon or not, your political swaying. I mean, he builds a domestically built car. It's one of the great cars. He built it in this country. So why not do the same for crypto? And I think for cannabis, we all ask the same question. Why would we outsource our capital markets to, backwater Canadian exchanges? And why would we, regulate adult use and medical cannabis and, be attacked while hemp proliferated in corner stores? These are hard things to anticipate, but I still think Jushi has the right, as many of these companies do. I think they run good business, compliant businesses, and it's just a matter of time before you get continued growth in some of these states that you hope will move to adult use, and you displace the illicit market. If you think about it, Jesse, the assumption is this is $100+ billion kind of industry. It's still 70% run by, cartels, drug dealers, organized crime, non-regulated entities. It's a big part of the pie that if we could capture would make this business, I think, what we thought it would be.
Yep.
If you could operate like a normal company and pay normal taxes, I mean, that would be kind of nice, wouldn't it? And if your employees could get mortgages and they could have access to banking and they weren't discriminated against like as if they were themselves illegal aliens in this country, I think that would be great. So, I mean, there's a lot of things you can do to fix the business, but, we're in the depths of a bear market. I think people are despondent. I think, the bears even the bears are getting bored because there's not much more to go. And so I think it's, it's where you land in this type of situation.
I think, it's interesting about your point that 280E has done exactly what its intended function was, which I agree with. Is that was the idea. The challenge we have is a legal industry. We're basically posting these numbers right for them to all see, but there's a complete lack of enforcement on the unlicensed or the illegal businesses, and they're not properly filing their tax returns. So they're not being held accountable to that same tax code that was what the whole spirit of it was for when there was no legal market. It was trying to capture that and try to be a discouragement against operating illegal businesses. But our industry without enforcement, it's really made an unfair advantage to the point where the IRS is going after those with state legal businesses instead of going after those that are completely illegal businesses. So that's, while we've been waiting for reform at the federal level, I think that's been a huge miscalculation from the federal government, is their job was to go after those that are purely illegal, not those that are state legal. And that's really allowed this all to happen. I mean, you could say similarly with the hemp side of things, where there's just been no effective regulation and no enforcement largely. I mean, I know there's been some one-offs where it's been so clearly obvious that they've just been moving cannabis into the hemp world and calling it hemp. But so I just thought that was an interesting point you were making around 280E. But I also thought it was interesting was you guys were talking about M&A and that one particular deal, and how I would like to tie this back to FiSai is, one of the challenges with M&A in our space is the debt side and how you do resolve that. Like, it's one thing to say, like, we can move assets here, do this, divest this, but all of these companies, or a substantial amount of them, have cross collateralization, real estate debt, like all these kind of, or real estate, sale leasebacks, things that can make it a lot more challenging. But, putting on your FiSai hat, like, how do you think about liquidity in the system from an M&A perspective, with where these companies are valued at relative to debt, and how you see transactions being able to get done, and how to work through it from the debt perspective?
Yeah, look, I think it's challenging. I think, it's, if you think about the debt stack, and I'll include just the capital stack, you have equity, then you have unsecured, you have sale leasebacks, and you have, in some cases, secured. And I'm talking about mostly the large public MSOs. I don't know about the privates. So I think, and in any M&A deal, I think one of the things you have to most probably look at is the sale leasebacks. I think they are very problematic for the industry. I think they were struck at times and at valuations that are huge.
Mm-hmm.
I'll talk about a company that I only read about, but IIPR, I think their largest single exposure is to PharmaCann.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm not incorrect, it's New York. And I think it's something in the order of like 140 or 150 million is the size of that sale leaseback. That's just an enormous number. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to have to be, rationalization of all of those in order to come up with a deal that works. So I don't, Jesse, Morgan, I don't think it's an easy answer, but there's an answer. You just have to decide where the pain is taken, and you have to go through those portfolios. And I think that's ultimately, if things are upside down and they've got debt against a business that is completely over-levered, you have to make some decisions.
Right.
So
And,
that's what will happen, Morgan. I think you'll start to see that happen more and more. And I think it's going to be, it's going to be a negotiation.
Yeah. And I'd say a further wrinkle to that is when these some of these debt groups are on the listed exchanges, their levers are a lot more limited, where it's even written into their documents they can't default on these things. They can't take operational control. So they're just stuck with a lot of zombies, or unwilling to declare default on things that are clearly in default.
Which could be long-term good for the market. I mean, if you have large facilities that are not operational, you get less supply. So I think you're going to see lots of that. But I think ultimately it comes down, and I think this, I think what you guys are doing is great. It ultimately comes down to, I think as an industry, we need to be very vocal about the state of the industry. I think we need to be making an argument on why. I wrote a piece recently on this, which was, the relatively easy things to do in the industry, which I don't think Democrats or Republicans or anyone can argue with, which is like, let's just have some common sense laws. Like if THC is regulated, it's legal. And if THC is unregulated, it's illegal. And, it's THC and you can put an emoji next to it. You can put a letter next to it. You can put a number next to it. But, THC is THC. So let's just regulate it.
Yeah.
And that is, I make the analogy is if vodka comes from potato versus grain alcohol, it's still vodka.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why are we splitting the hairs on the underlying, proponent of vodka being potatoes? It's not vodka, it's alcohol. So I think THC, we have just, I think very few people can argue that. I think, bringing 100 billion of illicit money into the regulated market and putting those back into the pockets of hardworking Americans, I don't understand how we wouldn't want to do that as a country for so many reasons. I mean, we're going after cartels because of fentanyl, but those same cartels are trafficking in all sorts of products, and THC is one of them, and that funds their operations. Why would we want to not put the brake on that? Why would you not allow 500,000 workers in this country to be banked? I mean, we're being debanked, there, no access to mortgages. There's just so many social issues around that which, remain, to be done. And the final thing is, why wouldn't you want to do with cannabis what you've done with crypto? Just bring it into the US and build a highly regulated, medically focused, market where states are allowed to determine what they want to do. Nothing, adult use, medical, both. It's up to them. These feel like such clear kind of middle of the road paths, and we seem to just be getting caught up in, gridlock and clearly lots of alternative issues. And, Jesse, you and I have talked about this. I mean, clearly, if you see what's happened with US aid, and you see some of the nefarious games that have been played with illicit monies and manipulations of stuff, it is hard to not sit back and go, well, who else is benefiting from the illicit cannabis 100 billion market? Like, what if we are prepared as a country to allow Afghanistan to grow poppies because we thought it was less disruptive than, eliminating the poppy fields in Afghanistan, which then ultimately created opioids that came back into the country? I mean, you could almost think about cannabis as the perfect drug. It's a huge market. It doesn't kill anyone. The HHS has already said it's not lethal. It's not really highly addictive. It has some medical benefits. So in many ways, that 100 billion cash cow that the government has allowed to foster and has not regulated, maybe there are lots of people benefiting. And I think the hemp industry has been a small beneficiary of that, being able to bring THC products under the loophole. But I think, let's not, I don't think of the hemp people as our foe. I mean, they are our friends. I mean, they want to create the same product we do. I'm sure they want to be regulated because, as we know in cannabis, guess what? In California, if you don't regulate the market correctly, if I'm not incorrect, it proliferates, and the regulated market now has to compete with the unregulated market. So regulation works for everyone who wants to build long-term businesses. Regulation doesn't work for those people who are in for a quick buck or looking to skirt the edges. And so I think, as an industry, that's really where we should be focusing, because, I think we can get the capital structures right and we can get all of that right, but, more years of a lack of regulation, and specifically around 280E, rescheduling and banking, it's just very difficult that ultimately the legal, state-led medical and adult use programs are going to just succumb to the 70% of the market, which is illegal gangs and drug dealers and nefarious organizations. And I just don't see how that long-term benefits the American people.
Right. So, we have this tricky landscape, as you're mentioning, we're at this extermination, extinction period. It feels like this has taken a long time, this event. Like, I feel like we've been talking about the extinction event. I remember talking with policy groups, probably 2021, 2022, where I said, if we don't get some federal reform, 90% of this industry is going to go bankrupt. And, I was not taken seriously. And, kind of here we are. And, it makes me think a little bit of like the commercial real estate industry that's been clearing a lot of bankruptcy over the last couple of years already. You're seeing buildings getting haircut down 20%, but they're clearing and getting done and moving on. Why do you think the cannabis industry is so slow in this process of clearing out, or just, to your point, like rationalizing, even the Canadian LPs, like there's been a tremendous amount of bankruptcies. And I know we can't go through federal bankruptcy, but there's plenty of other ways to clear. But it just seems like people are unwilling to do that. And it comes from both the equity and the debt side. There's just groups that just seem like they just want to keep going. And we just are stuck with a lot of zombies. What is it going to take for a reckoning so we can finally clear and get to a better place?
I think the reckoning is here. Don't you agree? The equity markets, for all intents and purposes, are completely broken. We have a large refinancing wall coming up in end of 26. We have 280E ballooning on balance sheets. So I think we're here, and I just think that process is happening as we speak. Even the best of the best in the market are, GTI by far the best run winner in the industry. And even that CEO is in the dumps. Ben is I think he's a fantastic operator. I think he's a visionary. I think he's done a great job. How do you not? He's really, he's called this all along, but even he is depressed. And so I think you get to that point where when there are no more roads to turn down, you start to make the hard decisions. And I just hope that we as an industry come together and get that message to our regulators and specifically to the politicians who, Morgan, I suppose there's another way you could think about it, which is, our good prohibitionist friends may be just licking their chops because, all they needed to do was stall reform long enough for this industry to collapse, which is what it's doing. But I have the same question I always have. And so that's to our prohibitionist friends. And so who exactly do you think takes our place?
I agree.
80 years
assumptions aren't going away.
Yeah, we're 80 years into prohibition. It hasn't worked. We're just coming off the highest death toll we've ever had from a drug with the opioid crisis. Cannabis is ubiquitous across the landscape. It's debunked as having, high addiction issues, and it's debunked about, to most of the prohibitionist arguments. Even someone as tautological as Glenn Youngkins in Virginia. Virginia to me is the prototype of idiocy and nefariousness, because let me get this right. So you can possess cannabis in Virginia up to, I think it's almost 4 ounces, which is, never had 4 ounces in my house, but anyway, it doesn't matter. You can possess cannabis, but you have to buy it from a drug dealer. That's like saying you can drink whiskey, but only bootleggers can distribute and sell that to you. If that worked, why isn't Al Capone the largest distributor of alcohol in America today? If that system was such an incredibly good system, and then for someone like Youngkins, this guy is, let's just talk about him, incredibly smart. He was one of the top people at Carlyle. Morgan, you've been in the business, Jesse. There's no more difficult or hard armed or brutal a business than Carlisle. I mean, those guys, kicking people out of tenement housings to restructure them, they are sharp-elbowed. That's a great businessman. In his rebuke of a legislative adult use program, he claimed that effectively it was, if he was asked to manage the program, it would be more dangerous than cartels and drug dealers doing it on his behalf. So when you look at that, you have to ask yourself, okay, Glenn, you are a smart man. You clearly have ambitions. I'm sure you're a man of great faith. What else is driving you to allow a $3.5 billion illicit market, which is, run by drug dealers, cartels? Morgan, but he's rich already. So it can't be the money, but it must be the other nefarious USA type things. There's more to this game than just, he's not getting paid. He doesn't need to make more money, but he has got himself into the mindset that regulating cannabis. And by the way, I am sure that the Youngkins type people, and you see it with Jamie Dimon and crypto, there are people that have just decided that something doesn't work for their organization. And so you just poo-poo it as long as you can. Now, Jamie Dimon may ultimately turn out to be correct about crypto. It may be a big farce. I don't know. I'm not making a comment on it. I'm just saying we've seen this before. So I think you have the same problem, in my view, in cannabis, is that you have these embedded views where there's so many other things that are playing at work here. But I mean, I don't know how you can be the governor of Virginia and be driving down the street and see endless signs of head shops that say THC in here, and being able to walk in and buy untested, unregulated, potent THC at a store, and yet you oppose the regulated market, which, for those people listening, you actually can't even walk into a dispensary in Virginia unless you have a medical card. So you can be a state, you can't even walk through the front door. There's no advertising on the outside. You have to go to a pharmacist. Like, it is highly regulated. And yet right next door to these stores exist head shops. The people at Normal can run you through just, and by the way, you can get it delivered in Virginia. You can get delivered from California into Virginia. So like, when you look at that, you ask yourself, what is it that is driving Glenn Youngkins? An incredibly smart, articulate, thoughtful, patriotic man. I mean, this is not a bad guy, but something is clearly focusing his attention away from the regulation. And I'm not sure what it is. Maybe it's the fact that ultimately
he's also denying the will of the people.
Oh, well, that.
So, to your point, like but for being a smart person, I mean, we see this in other states too, that, they have this issue with this legal industry, and then they let the proliferation and have no problem with it, selling to kids, selling this garbage stuff that's laced with God knows what, because there's no regulation or testing or age gating or anything. It's happening in Florida, it's happening in Texas, it's happening everywhere.
We're not making, somehow that message is not being made by us correctly. We've got 500,000 people that work in the industry. We've got millions of customers. We should be able to make ourselves heard better than we have been. And I think we need
they have a bipartisan legislation that both sides. It's right. I mean, in Virginia, this is a bipartisan bill, and he refuses to sign it. So, it's not even like it's one side or the other. Both sides have come to the table, gotten something, and he just says, "I will not sign it." So, to your point, there's something else going on there, but it's horrible for the will of the people. So,
if you've been in finance as long as you and I have, when things don't make sense, there's usually a very good reason. I remember back in 2008 during the financial crisis, and everyone was explaining to you back then about correlation and, correlation trades, and you do a correlation hedge, and you can't really explain how it happens because it's black box and your math's not good enough. And you would always be listening to it going,
I remember the banning, you have to ban short selling, you have to ban it.
Like you heard all of this stuff around it. And then, of course, when the House of Cards came down, you figured out, oh, it was because your annual bonus was tied to the NPV that you got every year, and so I get how that worked. And so I think in cannabis I think we need to expose this farce that, who else is benefiting from this $100 billion that's flowing into illicit markets, into drug dealers, into cartels? Like, why are you so happy to allow that to exist, but you want to clamp down on 12 to 6 homegrown plants in Ohio? So that's the thing you focus on. And then I think we as an industry have made mistakes as well. I think, the driving, I think we have to also accept that there is high concentration THC is a problem, and states should be allowed to put regulations around that. I think we have to also embrace that. I think that's just common sense. And I suppose, I know that it's a tough day in the markets again. It's been a tough few years in cannabis, but I think, when you have someone like Donald Trump, and if you just take it from a business perspective, this is a man that sat down with, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that with a person that may operate a very good business in Florida, and very quickly figured out that common sense reform works, that this is something that people want. A lot of young people support this, that it's tax revenue. And just like with crypto, let's bring it into the economy. Let's manage it and regulate it and make sure that it's distributed in a smart way. Let's build a great business around it, an American business around it. And so I think we need to keep pushing that narrative and find more people who understand that construct. Because, Morgan, just think about how quickly people turned on crypto. I mean, literally 2 years ago, it was persona non grata. It was Silk Road. You remember Silk Road, drug dealers. You just heard that mantra of why crypto shouldn't work. And then suddenly you have, someone running for president who goes, well, why don't we just own that? Why don't we just regulate it and put it in our country and build the greatest crypto business that ever existed? Why would we not want to control that? Why would we want to outsource that to the Chinese or the Moldovians or the Russians? Like, why would we do that? Why wouldn't we just bring it inside? And I think we really, as an industry and as a population, need to really do that with cannabis. Will we or won't we? I don't know. But to me, that does feel like a very difficult, as you said, Morgan, when you look at Virginia and you look at the legislator, they came to that decision pretty easily, which is, it's better that we run it and control it and manage it than Mexican cartels, Chinese gangs, organized crime, nefarious organizations. That just was like, why would we not do that? And then bring law enforcement in to close down the bad guys. And so that's a win-win for everyone, just like we do on alcohol. I mean, I'm always amazed. I mean, I remember in New York, if you opened a restaurant and you would go in and you would be like, hey, can I have a bottle of wine? They'd be like, sorry, you don't have a license. You're like, come on, just go to the back. They'll be like, no, you can't do that. If we're caught serving alcohol without a license, they'll shut us down. Like, I was always amazed by that. I mean, if you didn't have a license, no, we're not going to the back. Can't do that. Cannabis, it's like, oh yeah, you can do that in cannabis. Like, it makes no sense. We know how to regulate. We know how to police. We know how to enforce. That is not difficult. I just think it's really getting to the bottom. And I think this is where US aid and a lot of what's happening with Doge going in and just saying, oh, by the way, it's not always as good as it looks. There are lots of fingers in the pie. And, as I said to you, $100 billion piggy bank of cannabis, illicit, uncontrolled, untraceable money. I don't know. I suppose there's lots you can do with that. And you can allow lots of things to happen and buy lots of influence by just not cracking down on a certain cartel bringing, $10 billion worth of product into the US a year. And then maybe you get a piece of the action or it influences what you want done. But it's clearly, you have, as you said, you have the will of the people. You have a product that makes absolute sense. It's creating 500,000 jobs and more. And yet a small minority of vocal prohibitionists seem to be able to stall reform. That's very suspicious. And I'm not one of these people wanting to call suspicion everywhere, but it just doesn't make sense. And Virginia is a great, the great thing about Florida is they don't even hide it. I mean, DeSantis is, the wonderful thing about DeSantis is he's just openly corrupt. I mean, he was like, oh, I'm going against Kim because you know what? I want to prove that I'm tougher than Donald Trump. And at the same time, I'm just going to allow intoxicating hemp to be everywhere. So, I mean, he didn't really give a shit about the kids. He didn't give a damn about any of that. It was just a political game. I mean, DeSantis is exactly how this game is played. It was just a football for him.
And so how do you think we can get better, Erich? We find ourselves in a precarious situation on the political side where, basic things like safe banking, I wouldn't call rescheduling basic, but the rescheduling process is taking a super long time. We feel like we're a long ways away from federal legalization. We're stuck on these lower exchanges. I think you're identifying the problems in your mind as an industry. What do you think we need to do to move forward and find a solution?
Look, I think, we should be very proud of the work that Kim Rivers did. I mean, she's like the only major participant that I've come across in the industry who put a lot of her money behind what she believed in. She campaigned actively. She got in front of Donald Trump. I mean, I think all of these things are incredibly positive. I mean, I think as an industry, I would hope, and it's already happened. The major MSOs are putting money and effort and time behind, what's going on in DC. I think it just needs to be more of that. I really do, Jesse. I think it's the business side aside. There's lots to be fixed. I think there's M&A, there's combinations. I think you need to rationalize that. But I think on the political side, I think you just need to see more of that coming together. When I speak to the CEOs, they tell me that they're as well coordinated as they've ever been. I mean, I don't want to put a positive spin on it, but it's just a fact. Not a single MSO CEO met with Biden or Harris in 4 years. I mean,
that's not for lack of trying. I mean, we tried.
No, Morgan, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that. I mean, but receptivity of this administration seems to be a lot better.
Totally.
It's a business-orientated organization. So we were hampered with a lot of social issues and criminal justice and DEI. And quite frankly, I just think Schumer was never going to actually do anything. I think he's bought and paid for whatever it was. Chuck Schumer was never going to do anything, but we have business-minded people in DC, and I think those people are much more receptive to the things that we see going on, the arguments we make, and I think we need to keep making those, and it's going to take time. And I think, there's no quick fix, but I think the industry is working really hard. I think Kim Rivers, I think we all should be incredibly supportive and ask her what we can do to help. And I think the big CEOs are trying hard. I would love to see, maybe some of the better guys, focus more on how we can fix stuff than to keep pointing out problems. But I understand their frustration as well. And so, I mean, I think at desperate times, I think we also have to go hat in hand to DC and say, guys, this business is blowing up. We are going out of business. We cannot operate under the rules and regulations and taxes that you are imposing upon us. And ask the simple question: when we disappear, who takes our place? And is that really a better alternative to American ingenuity, American entrepreneurs, people trying to do the right thing, running the business the right way? Is that really kind of in the long-term benefit of this country? And, the old saying is, America never does anything until the last possible moment. And so with cannabis, I think we're getting to the last possible moment. I mean, after this, it's just ceding the 30% of the market that we've captured from, the cartels and the drug dealers and the organized crime. And are we just ceding it back to that market, or do we try and reclaim it for ourselves.
Do you think the politicians have any idea the challenges that we're facing and this, really serious predicament that we're in, that if things don't change, there may not be much of a legal cannabis industry?
A guy like Glenn Youngkins, let's just use Glenn again. I mean, he's too smart not to.
Right.
Now, does he realize how bad it is, and does he care is a separate discussion. But yeah, I think it's a 500,000 jobs. It's a lot of jobs. It's a lot of investment. And I don't think anyone enjoys driving up and down, their streets of their town and seeing an endless array of THC products available at corner stores with precarious and unknown lineages. I just don't think ultimately that's the society we want. I think that's what's emerged. And I think ourselves and hemp should be very concerned that if we don't find a regulated THC market and that we don't have common sense laws and regulations around it, I think we could be faced with a backlash we don't want to have, which is to try and, do what the prohibitionists want, which is, do another, go from 80 to 90 years of failed prohibition. I mean, if it wasn't good for 80 years, it's, I suppose, only better for 90.
Yeah.
So I really think,
So,
Jesse, it comes down to, I think these companies are working hard. They're cutting costs. They're getting their balance sheets in place. I think you're going to see rationalization across the industry. But I think the bigger threat to us is getting our message across to regulators and to the politicians that, the alternative to us is really a very bad alternative. I mean, it's unregulated. It's dangerous. It's really not what we want to do. And it really, the parallel to crypto just couldn't be, to me, more stark. The difference is that, crypto is a much bigger business and much better money behind it. It has a much shorter negative legacy. So, people tried to paint that with the Reefer Madness legacy early on, but that got debunked. Some people like, some CEOs of banks are still trying to paint that, but that's pretty much been undone. And now you bring it into the regulated market and you put transparency on it. In the light of transparency, it's just like the light of transparency, the light of common sense laws and regulations is really where I think we need to be saying you need to go. And I think they are and will be receptive to the argument. I think we've been making the wrong argument. I think the argument we've been making about social justice and DEI, and those may have been very important to certain, but right now, I think broadly, it's back to business. What do they say? The business of America is business.
right.
Like, we're not a country that believes in gray markets and cartels and organized crime running things. I mean, that's the reason we've dismantled them over time. And this just feels to me like a no-brainer. ND banking, common sense regulation, bring back 100 billion to hardworking Americans from, cartels and drug dealers, and build a great, well-regulated industry that we can all profit from. I mean, really, who is against that other than maybe Grassi or some old, 93-year-old who's really just doesn't get it?
Yeah. So, Erich, one thing we try to do in the show here is we talk about some of the misery that we're experiencing, but we try to also figure out, what can we learn from this pain? What can we learn from these experiences? And we're all similar-ish ages. And I think back to the real tough markets in my career, I was probably 25 around the time of the tech boom and bust. I was working at Fisher Investments, and I remember during that we did a bunch of studies about cash burn rates, and we saw this group of tech companies that was going to be running out of money, and we saw that bubble was going to bust, and we made some great portfolio decisions. Zero credit to me, all credit to Ken Fisher, but that was a learning lesson for me back then. That sucked, but we learned from it. I think back to '07 and '08, and I was co-managing a fund of hedge funds back then. And Morgan, you brought up the word correlation earlier, or maybe Erich did, but yeah, back then I learned about correlation. We were doing quantitative stuff in equities that had nothing to do with what was going on in the debt markets. But you realize if the banks all held similar positions in this stuff, if they needed liquidity, your portfolio was going to suffer, even though historically it has never been correlated to these things. So I learned about correlation from them, and we had a painful 6 months or so in that fund that we were managing. Here we are now, 4 years, a little over 4 years into this cannabis bear market. MSOS peaked, I think, at $55.90 on February 11th, 2021. Here we are on March 13th. I haven't looked today, but it's around 250 or 275. So down 95% plus. And I'm always thinking, Erich, what can we learn from this, both to help us get out of the situation, but also to be better investors moving forward? So what do you think about these challenges that these businesses have been through, the things you've seen with Jushi? What are the lessons that you've learned over the last 4 years that you'll take forward with you?
Yeah, I think it's, I'll quote what I heard just on an interview with Donald Trump. I mean, irrespective of your political views, the one thing he was asked about, and he said, over time, why have some people made it in business and some haven't? And he just simply said, because too many people gave up too early. I mean, I think you have no further to look than the challenges that man has been through over the last 8 years, and he managed to survive. And the CEO of Jushi sent me a similar piece from Altman from the AI, OpenAI, who basically was like, when you start a business, let me tell you, more goes wrong than you can ever possibly believe. And the true winners in industries are just those people that can keep figuring out ways to stay alive and keep at it and just never give up. It's just so much harder than you possibly believe. And this is an industry that didn't really exist with adult use 10 years ago. It's already 10 years old. We haven't even captured 30% of the illicit market. 70% of the market is still run by drug dealers and cartels and organized crime. Like, we're making this up. When we built massive grows, we didn't know how to build grows. We didn't know how to run a seed through sale tracking. We're not allowed to advertise. We're subject to 280E. We can't lend. We can't get bank lines. We can't get mortgages. Like, it's just an absolute slog. You got to keep slogging. You got to keep creative. You got to keep your head above the water. You got to keep believing that ultimately, I don't think America wants cannabis distributed by drug dealers, by cartels, in cash only, at corner stores with no age gating. I just don't believe that. I just don't believe that that is what Sam believes is the forward. I just don't think legal possession in Virginia without legal procurement is a solution. I just cannot believe that. So I think you guys do a great job. You come on here. We've got to talk about the facts. Yes, opium is not something we should smoke. But let me tell you, those of us that are going to be standing in, I don't know if it's 1, 3, 5 years, but we're going to build a great business. And it's going to be a great business. It's going to be well run, but it's a hard road. It's going to continue to be a hard road. And I'm incredibly optimistic about the long term. I just think it's been hard and will keep getting harder. No one says it's going to get easier. I mean, like, there's no reason it's going to get easier, but we have good arguments to make. We've got great products. It's a fantastic product. And it changes lives. It's got downside, and we have to recognize those. But I mean, come on. I mean, how many people talk about how it's changed their lives or changed their pain management? There are downsides too, and we have to be cognizant of those. But you see them on Twitter when people talk something. There's 1 or 2 bad comments, and then just streams of just positive reviews. So, and the voting public, we know that. Even in Florida, where else in the world can 56% be a loss? Like, it's insane.
Yeah, and get ready for them to raise that threshold as they're contemplating.
Morgan, an interesting thing. Do you know that the 60% threshold passed in Florida at 56%? So when they imposed the 60% threshold, it passed with 56% yeses. It didn't
No
even
way.
the 60% threshold didn't even get to 60%. Someone can fact check me, but I heard that from a reliable source. How's that? They couldn't even get to 60% to enforce 60%. Maybe someone listening can Google that on ChatGPT.
Wild. Well, that's a depressing quote of the day. So, because that's
before we move forward, Morgan, what were you saying? They're talking
Yeah.
about maybe moving that up from 60 in Florida.
oh yeah, there's talk in the Florida legislature about moving the 60% threshold higher because they were not happy with how close abortion and cannabis almost passed
Jesus.
in the last elections. They want to make the hurdle rate even higher. I don't know what that rate they're contemplating, but I mean, just making it basically impossible.
Yeah.
So there's Florida for you. But so the survivors here, we're kind of like cockroaches. I mean, to your point, there's a bit of free market aspect that I do appreciate, that good businesses will find a way, and you've got to survive. You got to find ways of operating successfully and navigating all this stuff. But as you're putting your FiSai hat on, like, what kind of characteristics or what do you look for in companies that give you signals that these are survivors, that whether it's from the equity side, I know that's not on your side of things, but from the debt side of things too. I mean, when we're looking at businesses, we're underwriting them for the value of the business, whether it's equity or credit, because both sides, we think, need to work for ultimately for the lenders to get repaid and for the equity being rewarded. But what kind of characteristics do you look for?
Yeah. I mean, I think you have to have businesses at least that have a capital structure that makes sense. I don't think you can throw good money off the bat. And so I think in those situations, you need to restructure. So I think you need to get the capital structure to a position where you have an opportunity to win. I mean, you just cannot be upside down on your mortgage. Then I'm telling you, the next thing is it's management. And that is something we're still short of in the business.
Mm-hmm.
Love or hate Ben Kovler. Guy's a good manager. He's had a consistent team. Kim, good manager, consistent team. I think feel the same with Verano. I think they're good businesses. They've all got their challenges. They've all made their mistakes. But I think that the big US MSOs have at this stage pretty good management teams. Some of the second tiers, I think, have good management teams. Some don't. And then, Morgan, I don't know the privates, but I'm sure there are people like, I think, Jason Bedati. He's got a long track record. He's learned. So I think it's management and it's capital structure. And so I think you need to marry those two together. You need to make the hard decisions. You have to get rid of things that just don't work. I think you have to take the pain. And we're feeling that pain in the stock market every day. And I think if you can do that and you focus on the regulatory side, and I always say on the regulatory side, it's why I always talk about Kim Rivers. She's Elon Musk. She's the Doge. She's not sending a head of IR or sending, a lawyer that she has, or hiring, a lobbyist to go and lobby for her. She's rolling up her sleeves. She's going to DC and she's making the case herself. I would ask that. Get your capital structures in place. Make sure you have a management team that is focused. And by the way, fire half your people. You've got too many people. I mean, you guys are not even making enough money not paying 280E. Get that cost structure right. Get rid of the businesses that don't make sense. And the people with the biggest stake in the company should be in Washington, D.C. They should be the ones pushing the message. Stop outsourcing it to paid people and lobbyists. I mean, come on. If Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, thought that he could have hired someone who worked for him to run Doge, he would have done it. What does he do? He sleeps on the floor of his facilities. I mean, this guy makes it his problem and he fixes it. I would love to see the big CEOs and the big people, including people like ourselves, who have big stakes. We need to be rolling up our sleeves and we need to be supporting the people in Washington, like our lobbyists, but we need to be with them. There's this guy, Don Murphy, you see him on Twitter all the time. irrespective of he's aligned mostly with us. But let me tell you, he's on the hill. He's in front of people. He's pushing. He is always where the game is happening. And I'll ask myself, some of these expensive lobbyists that are participants that, some of the big organizations pay, are they there? Are they doing the work? So I think it's a mixture of those. I mean, I know it's a tall order, but I think if you want to survive, make the hard decisions to get your capital structure in place, make sure that you've got a really talented management team. And by the way, get rid of half of the people that you have, specifically your managers and the bullshit jobs and the HR manager of the HR manager of the HR manager. You need growers, you need people working at the stores. And then the people with the biggest economic interest, roll up your sleeves, get to Washington, tell the story, be humble, but forceful about where we are as an industry and why, people should have us there, and not outsource this to cartels and drug dealers and organized crime. It just doesn't make sense.
Just one follow-up, and I'll pass it back to Jesse. But so I understand for sure capital structure, quality management for the operational side, putting emphasis on reform. I was very frustrated to read today in Marijuana Moment that the Cannabis Caucus in DC has yet to meet in 2 months. So they haven't even picked up the pen yet in this new Congress.
Who runs that?
Is it still Schumer? I don't know. David Joyce had some really great choice words for anyone to check out that article. I won't say it here just for in case any kiddos are listening. But
we have a big 18 in their audience. Working huge.
Yeah. But on the back to the operational side, I think one of the biggest challenges for a lot of these companies that have decent management teams but have more challenged capital stacks is a deceleration of growth or outright decline in growth. And now looking at not just 1 year, but 2 years, and now some are looking at 3 years. So it makes it harder and harder, right? Because that debt doesn't shrink for a lot of these companies. That debt just becomes a bigger piece of the pie. So, is how much is growth an input from your perspective, for viability?
I mean that's company by company, but ultimately, yeah. I mean that's problematic, and so I think you have to look through your entire debt stack and figure out what you can exit and what you can't exit. And I think it's again, as I said to you, I think it's challenging. We don't have access to Chapter 11. So I think that over the next 12 or 18 months, I think we're gonna have to address that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have one more segment to close out with. We call it Ask Grok, where we ask an AI question. But before we get there, Erich, anything you wanted to talk about today that we didn't get to?
Ask Grok what the percentage of Florida voting on the 60% threshold was as a passing number.
Okay. We'll check that one out. But Morgan, why don't I throw it over to you? We'll finish up with the Ask Grok, and we'll close this one out.
Okay. I did ask Grok that, so while it's thinking, I will do this one just because that is a great question. All right, so my question is actually pretty timely for our discussion today. I asked Grok. Asked, what other sectors does cannabis remind you of from how investors behave in cannabis? And Grok says, investors behave in cannabis sector mirrors patterns seen in other speculative, high growth, or boom bust industries where hype, regulatory uncertainty, and emerging opportunities drive irrational exuberance. Noted the dot-com bubble. Cannabis craze echoes the dot-com frenzy where investors poured money into anything with a dot-com attached, much like they chased stocks with cannabis in its name. Both cases had valuations soar far beyond their fundamentals. Pets.com and Tilray hitting 20 billion. Never forget that one. Biotech startups, cannabis shares similarities with speculative biotech, where investors bet on unproven companies promising breakthroughs. Investors in biotechs like Theranos, or overhyped cannabis firms like CanTrust. I'll never forget the the Barclays report, or that was like the first big banked deal in cannabis, and like a month later it was caught for fraud. Cryptocurrency and blockchain, The crypto boom is a close cousin, both fueled by a mix of libertarian enthusiasm, retail FOMO, and visions of disrupting traditional systems. Investors piled into Bitcoin or obscure altcoins like they did Aurora, Cannabis, or penny pot stocks, often ignoring fundamentals or speculative momentum. Regulatory uncertainty, SEC crackdowns on ICOs versus US federal cannabis illegality, both keep sectors volatile. With wild pumps, noting Dogecoin and Tilray again. In all three, you see the same cocktail, a transformative story, early adopters getting rich, and a herd of latecomers overpaying at the top. The investor psychology, greed, hope, and fear of missing out feels eerily familiar. Each sector eventually matures, but not before shaking out the overeager and underprepared.
We're in it.
Yeah, the thing I talk about, guys, which in hindsight is super naive, is I underestimated the political influence in the sector. That I feel like the tech, sometimes I think the tech boom and bust was similar in some ways, but just the way we become hostage politically is something that I didn't fully, obviously didn't fully account for when I entered the space.
Yeah, it felt so logical. It felt like, why would you not want to remove 100 billion, put it into the hands of the American people? Why wouldn't you want tested, controlled product? People were voting and still vote in, I don't know. I thought 50 was a majority, but it seems 60% is now the majority. But, you see that. And then the other thing I think, Jesse, is again, I think we underestimated the nefarious backwaters of cannabis, which, by the way, my illicit friends always talked about. They're always like, you don't have any idea how embedded this business is in the fabric of law enforcement and enforcement. Nothing better than, Ann Milgram deciding to back channel to a prohibitionist organization in order for her to defend rescheduling. Like, it's just like, how does that happen?
Yeah.
So, Eric, you're right. 57.8% of Floridians voted to raise the threshold to 60%. That was back in 2006.
Oh, God.
You couldn't even get to 60 to get to 60.
Oh, the sad, sad irony.
There you have it. It was great, guys. Thank you so much for having me on, and you guys do a good job. And I appreciate it. It's good. It's good for us to get there. It's nice not to hear the bullshit. It's just the facts. And I appreciate being on it, and I love being in the sector, and I'm still, confident that, something will emerge. It was probably going to be different to what we thought it was going to be, but, we've seen it with our crypto friends. They got what they wanted.
Yep.
They were at it long enough. They fought it. They had to endure bankruptcies. It was brutal. People forget that.
Yep. Yeah, this was really fun, Eric. I thought you'd be a great guest, and you did not disappoint. So very much appreciate you joining us, and hope you'll come back and see us again next time. And Morgan, always good to catch up with you. We're still juggling next week's show. I'm going to be at Hall of Flowers on Wednesday and Thursday, so we're going to see if we can sneak one in on Tuesday or Friday. So we'll keep in touch with you guys on that one. But appreciate everyone listening, and we'll talk to you guys again soon. The views expressed in this podcast are provided for informational purposes only. Nothing we say should be considered research or a recommendation. All investing involves risk, including the loss